So now we're talking about Section 7, constructing news. So we've made our way into talking about journalism via talking about objectivity and bias and things like that. So now let's talk about how you actually construct a news schedule. How do you determine what's going to make a newscast or a newspaper publication? How do you determine what the news is going to be? So you have a lot of choices. There's a lot of events that happen, especially if you're in a big town. A smaller town, maybe there's not as much news, but there's always stories to tell. So if you wanted to, you can find stories, you can find events. You have a lot to cover. How do you decide what to cover? And that's a process of news selection. Specifically, what we call this process of selecting the news, it's gatekeeping. And whatever the editor, we'll say the news editor or news director rather, the news director, whatever they decide to put on the air, that process of gatekeeping, it usually sets the agenda for that station, for that particular newscast, for that particular publication. And so this process of gatekeeping results in that agenda setting that we've been talking about already. But stories are also selected based on an organization's news values. And what I mean by that is that the station or the newspaper or whatever, they have to determine what news they think best reflects their attitude and opinion on how they want to conduct their business. They have values themselves, right? A lot of news organizations will have values that are similar. And I'm not really talking about ideology or politics there. I'm talking more about what stories do they value, or how do they give stories value. Perhaps maybe a better way to talk about that. So here's some news values that are pretty commonplace for a lot of organizations. The first being frequency. So frequency is just a matter of realizing how often do you publish, how often do you broadcast, and how does that impact the stories that you choose. For example, in my hometown, the publication date of the weekly newspaper, again, it's a small town, they only put out a weekly paper. It's once a week and it's on Tuesday. So when you wake up on Tuesday, there's going to be a new paper that tells you the news of that town. So you can imagine if the paper comes out on Tuesday, something that actually happens on Tuesday can't be covered by the paper, and by the time the paper comes out again, that event's already a week old. So you have to make a decision. As a newspaper or news director, do you want to publish something that happened almost a week ago? Do you still think that that's a valuable story that people want to hear about? So the same thing is kind of like with news on television. Is the story too old, or is it fresh enough? Right. Also, long drawn out events usually are not as favored as shorter discrete events, because you need to write them up, and you need to write them up quickly and put them out, right? Especially if you're publishing constantly, daily newspaper, daily newscast, right? So the frequency by which you publish or broadcast, that determines how you're going to pick certain programs, or not programs, I'm sorry, certain news stories and events. Amplitude is just the threshold of noticeability. In other words, how important is the event to your audience? Again, if we look at a town the size of Starkville, an apartment fire may be enough of an event, even if it was an apartment fire in Columbus, enough of an event that WCBI would cover it. And WCBI would have some kind of some kind of story about that apartment fire. The newspaper is going to have a story about that apartment fire. But if we take the same event and put it in a city the size of Atlanta or a city the size of New York, an apartment fire, unless it kills someone, an apartment fire is probably not going to be covered. Why? Because it doesn't seem dramatic enough or large enough to receive prominent coverage. There's probably several apartment fires or house fires a day in the Atlanta viewing area, in the New York viewing area, right? So the story has to have amplitude. It has to have some noticeability, or it has to have at least high amplitude versus low amplitude. So that's just the level of importance that that story has and significance that that story has for the community. Clarity. People tend to like events that are clear-cut, fairly one-dimensional, lack ambiguity. In other words, they like stories that have clear heroes, clear villains, clear victims, and that there's a start and a middle and a stop to an event, right? When we were talking about narrative analysis and how you tell stories, the news values stories that can be told in a fairly formulaic format or method. You know, here's what happened, here's the hero of the event, here's possible victims and villains of the event, and here's where we go with this story next. Yeah, or you wrap up that story. So, for example, take a burglar who comes in and it's a home burglary. So and so is, and I'll tell you, let's do this because I heard about this one on the radio the other day. Man comes home. There are two robbers in the house, and as the man comes in, he notices that the robbers are armed, and one of the robbers is yelling to the other one who he couldn't see, but he yells to the other one, "Time to go, they're here." And so the man that's in the house, the owner, he realizes these guys are armed. He runs to his closet where he has his weapon, and I think it's a rifle in particular that he has. The robbers see him pick up the gun and they begin firing first. Well, he shoots both of them, kills both of them, right? And it was said also in that piece that no charges were going to be brought against the homeowner because he was clearly defending himself and his house. That's a clear-cut, fairly one-dimensional story that lacks ambiguity. There's a clear hero, clear villain, and a clean outcome to that story. Cultural proximity, right? So we want stories that are near and dear to our hearts, or better explanation of that is near and dear to the things that we value in our culture. So, for example, if it's the opening of deer hunting season, perhaps WCBI here in the Golden Triangle, perhaps they cover that as an event, and they do a news piece about hunter safety and when the next hunter safety courses are going to be, or where you can take those courses, or giving some information about the hunting season. Culturally, that's relevant to us. Being in the Deep South, we have a lot of hunters. We have a lot of outdoor sportsmen, right? And so people may see that story and go, oh, okay, yeah, hunting season starts. I'm going to start seeing a lot of people on the side of the roads, going into the woods, and you need to be careful if you're hiking through the woods. Make sure you wear your orange vest and whatnot. So that has a cultural proximity to us. You would not see a story on the New York or the Chicago news about the opening of deer hunting season in Illinois. Um, that just doesn't fit with the culture that's there. Okay? And the same, stories about far off lands typically are not favored in relation to stories about local news operations. Or, not favored in local news operations, rather. Because it's hard for people, the audience, to relate to stories that involve far off places that they can't even really imagine or see. So you tend to stay within your own culture, right? Mississippi, or I tell you, here's another good example. In public access in New York, there used to be a news station. I think it was called Gay USA, and it was a weekly newscast that only talked about issues important to the LGBTQ community in New York. So it's a weekly newscast of relevant stories to the gay community. That might be fine on public access in New York City. It probably would not get a lot of views if we did some competing type of news program here in the Deep South, right? Why? Because the cultures are different, you know. So that matters. Predictability. The idea of predictability and then its counterpart, which is unexpectedness, is that predictability kind of goes back to that clarity issue where you like clear heroes, villains, endings to stories. So if something's highly predictable, people tend to watch it just to see, you know, if it confirms stereotypes that they have, right? So if you see a story that has to do with, I don't know, let's consider a bigger city, okay? And there's a story about protests that are happening out in the street. People are going to come to that story when they see it in the newspaper or they see it on the evening news on television. Their expectation is that, okay, there was a protest in the street. I wonder if there was violence. I wonder if the police responded and used tear gas or pepper spray or whatever. So if that happens, the news usually will show it, right? Because the audience is familiar with that type of story. And it was something that the audience kind of expected to happen anyway. And people look at it and you go, okay, yeah, they had a protest. Yep, and that's what happens when you have a protest in a big city. The police come and things get ugly. And so you sit there and you watch how things get violent and tense, right? It confirms what you believed anyway. Flip side of that is total unexpectedness. It's when you start to get involved with a story and you have this prediction that you're making. I bet this is how the story ends. And then it makes a total 180 turn. And you're left going, wait, how does this story end? What happened here? And it may be that there's some big dramatic shift in that story. Things that are taboo, you know, things that you don't do generally as a society. If that happens, the news is going to cover it. A mother kills her children. A son shoots and kills his mother. Huge dramatic things that just don't seem, a man does something horrible in terms of animal cruelty to pets that he owns. That'll get covered. It's unexpected. We don't think people really work that way. So when we see that thing happen, we want to know more. Continuity. Once a story does enter the agenda, and let's say it's not a clear, clean-cut kind of story, it is more advanced. It does have a lot of different details and a whole bunch of conundrums happening within it. It's this long, drawn-out, dramatic process. Once you can start that story in a news, or once you do start that story in the newspaper or newscast, and you tell people that it's an ongoing story, people will chime in to kind of figure out what's going on. For example, if we look at the prostitute situation with Stormy Daniels, people, once they hear that story, they're kind of hooked into, well, what's going to come of this? And so they check back. CNN will tell you in 2 nights from now, where's an update on this story? Whenever there's any little tidbit of news, we're going to update you on this story. They know that people are interested in the story, so they will continue to give you bits of it, right? So in this case, it's okay to keep drawing out the story and to keep giving people information about it, because in real time it's not a short, quick ending story. It is going to take time to develop. So I mean, you look at any big case. I mean, you look at the Stormy Daniels thing that's going on. You look at the O.J. Simpson case. You look at anything that's going to take a long amount of time to drag out and finish. People are going to be interested in where it's heading. Composition is the next thing we'll talk about. This is just that news providers, the newspaper, the newscast, they seek to relate news that either fits in line with their ideology, or they seek balance among all the stories. So composition is a news value. Does this story that we're going to tell, does it kind of fit in? It's, again, that material context. Is this story that we're going to tell, is that a story we typically would tell based on our ideology, based on the things that we valued in the past? Would we tell that story because it fits in line with that? If the answer is yes, then you run the story. If it's no, then you may have to think about whether you want to have that there. The other side of composition is not to say, well, let's just always run with the same type of story. The other aspect of composition is to say, let's seek balance. Okay? So, and this could happen in the topics that you cover. It could also happen in the atmosphere or feeling that the newscast has, right? So, I can remember one of the first times that my son watched an evening newscast with me, especially like a CNN newscast. And at the end of it, and he's very young at this point, but at the end of it, he looks at me and he says, "Those were just all horrible stories." He said, it just makes me think that the world is just really mean. And I said, I understand what you mean by that. I said, but you got to realize that it's those kind of crazy stories that seem important enough that the news thinks they ought to cover it. And he said, well, they should tell you a good story too. And that's composition, and that's compositional balance, right? And I'll have examples for you of this, but news agencies will try to do that. If they feel like the story is getting too heavy, it's getting too serious, the attitude is too serious, they'll throw in something lighter there to try to lessen the heaviness, to make it lighter, and to give you a reason of why you would want to view the newscast tomorrow, right? People see something that's dark and depressing, they probably don't want to come back to it again tomorrow. So if we look at news constraints, because selecting your news is also not just based on what you value, but it's based on your limitations too. So you may have deadlines or resource limitations or problems with your geographical focus that just make it not realistic for you to air a story. So what I mean by that is like a deadline. If you, like I said, if you have a story that, let's take an election, okay, and let's say the deadline for the newspaper is 9 p.m. that you start printing the newspaper for the next day at 9 p.m. that night. If the polls on an election close at 7 p.m. and it's a tight race and you're not going to have a final count or final say, you may choose just not to report any results at that time. So instead of writing a story that says, or broadcasting a story that says, well, 58% of the vote is in, and here's the way it's fleshing out. You may avoid doing that story. Why? Because you know you're not going to have all the information, right? If you feel like your information's not going to be fresh, not going to be relevant anymore, you don't cover that story because of deadline pressure. Okay. Resource limitations. You may not have enough money or staff or equipment to cover all the stories that you want to. You know, if we start talking about a city like Atlanta or New York, there's constantly stories to cover. But you only have so many staff members, so many cameras, right? Your budget is only so much, so you have to be more selective. You may decide that, you know, there's some major legislation being made in Jackson, but CBI says, you know, there's also about 5 or 6 other events that's taking place in Starkville today, and we just don't have the staff and the equipment to follow a story that is not happening within the Golden Triangle. So they may decide that they're not going to cover that thing in Jackson. Now, technology is getting easier and easier to use for news, right? There's several shots that I've seen lately, especially local news, where it's obvious that they are using their cell phone to shoot the video and send back to the news station. I've seen newscasts that go live somewhere, and when they say we're live at City Hall or whatever, it's obviously a reporter holding a camera. Or, you know, they've got a camera on a tripod or something on their phone, holding their phone, right? So it is getting cheaper to do things. So the resource limitations can get less and less, but travel is still expensive. Going places is still expensive. So you tend to stay more local. Then finally, the last news constraint is just geographical focus. Again, travel is difficult. It's expensive. And if you tell a story about some far-off place, your audience may not be interested, right? They may want to know, well, why are you covering a story about Washington, D.C. on WCBI during the local newscast? Surely when we have the national newscast, they'll cover national news, maybe some global news. So why run that story if you think it's going to be broadcast half an hour later in the national news? So your local news station may decide, okay, well, we're not going to run that. We're just going to focus on the Golden Triangle. Likewise, a CNN newscast may decide, hey, there was a huge disaster in Nairobi today, but they're not going to cover that because they don't think people will be as interested in something that's happening that far off, right? So that can constrain what is told. So that's that's the end of this lecture. I'm sorry if I seemed scattered and it seemed a little jumpy. I actually had two or three people kind of come in while I was recording, so I had to pause there at some places and do some little tricky editing. So sorry if it seems scattered and not focused. But I will see you in class. Everybody have a good day.